Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Psychedelic Seminar's third installment in the Racial Justice series. Today, we're going to be talking about defunding the police and ending prohibition. My name is Ife Tayo Harvey. I'm the marketing coordinator at the Drug Policy Alliance, founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. I'm going to be moderating today's conversation, which will consist of an hour-long discussion with 30 minutes for Q&A. So I'd like for my lovely panelists, Kassandra Frederique, Roman Haferd, and Neil Franklin to introduce themselves, and then we can get into the conversation. Kassandra?
Good afternoon. So my name is Kassandra Frederique. I am the incoming executive director at Drug Policy Alliance, and I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you. Roman?
Hi, Ife. Hi, Kassandra. Hi, Neil. And hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Roman Haferd. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I am a Restorative Justice Coordinator for the Office of the Attorney General here, which is our local prosecutor's office. And I also do restorative justice work outside of that. I just want to make a note that for this event, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and that's very important. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And Neil?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you guys. My name is Neil Franklin. After spending 34 years in policing in the state of Maryland, with the Maryland State Police and the Baltimore Police Department, I'm now the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, that's LEAP, where I've been for 10 years now. So thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm sure everyone realizes how timely this conversation is. Over the past couple of months, we've witnessed an enormous level of police militarization and violence, along with uprisings in response to the killings of Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, and many, many more. So 2020 isn't even over yet, and it's already been a hell of a year. To me personally, I think that all of this is showing us that a future without policing is not only possible, but necessary. So I want to open up the panel with the question of what are these uprisings telling us about the state of policing here in the US?
So I'll go ahead and begin. I think it's telling us something about the history of policing, that it was never designed for the benefit of Black folks. It was born out of slave patrols in the South, and it was born out of property protection for the wealthy in the North. And of course, slaves were considered property. Even coming forward through time over the past more than 100 years, at every turn, at every attempt to reform this system that was never designed for Black folks, I think we were able to see more and more into its failure. And I think what we're seeing, in short, is that there is a serious need for a deconstruction and reconstruction of policing, if that's what we want and feel we need going forward. But we definitely need, if we're going to keep some form of policing, I think what we're seeing now is telling us that we need a new model, a new policing paradigm, one that is designed for the inclusion of all people in this country, race, culture, gender, and we need with that a set of foundational principles from which to operate from that reflect that. But I think when we're talking about public health and public safety, we need to do a lot of work within our neighborhoods, within our community, so we get to a place of needing less and less and less of government intervention in the form of policing.
Thank you. I like how you brought up the history of policing, especially with slave patrols, because a lot of people aren't familiar with that history. And I think it speaks to a certain level of insidiousness within the institution itself. And so how is it even possible to get away from that inherently racist history that this institution holds?
Well, I'd just be real quick with that. We're seeing it. People are calling for it. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's how we do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to open up that question to other panelists as well. I'd love to hear your input. For you personally, what is this bringing up for you? We're all Black here, right? And so we know that we are disproportionately impacted by policing, our communities, our neighbors, our family. So this isn't only just like policy talk for us. A lot of this stuff is very, very personal for a lot of us, right? Like a lot of you know that my father was incarcerated for a drug charge and deported. And these are stories that are just endless in the US. So I wanted to also hear from Kassandra and Roman, what does this bring up for you? But also, what are your thoughts on what this represents for our country moving forward?
You want to talk, Kassandra? I mean, there's a lot of things that need to happen simultaneously. I think for me, it hurts to see the same old faces of my friends of color and folks on the front lines being arrested, but it's also kind of cool to see white people down there causing a ruckus. There's all sorts of nuanced questions that are being brought up now that even those of us who do this work are feeling like are fresh, and that's a good thing. I know that, you know, I kind of work, I work with law enforcement, and I've worked against law enforcement for much longer in my career in the adversarial setting of the legal system and the criminal justice system. And, you know, from either of those perspectives, it can be lonely to feel like, you know, you're the only one asking these questions. And on the prosecutorial side, which is just another arm of this thing, we've been frustrated for a long time because the public doesn't understand how much power these officials hold. People who are not being harassed by the police every day in their neighborhoods, they have a vague sense, you know. But I remember when I brought my white friend one time to my office in LA. It was the first trial boutique I worked in, a civil rights boutique, where we had, you know, old guard civil rights attorneys with all of their hard fought victories on the wall, you know, pictures of officers fire hosing Black folks at lunch counters and having their dogs, being able to, you know, they used to be okay to let their dogs loose basically into a crowd. And I was working at an office that had fought and won class actions to really limit the use of police dogs and things like that. And we walked out of the office, and my friend, she was sort of bewildered, and she said, well, I still don't understand, why would anybody sue the police? You know? And I was like, wow, you know, like that, there's still a great gulf of experience to be bridged. And I always, you know, as someone who I live in DC, you know, I'm in and amongst folks who are doing the peace building work, who are doing the action and the organizing work. I feel like that conversation, especially during COVID, just needs to happen in the street, you know, and we need more people who aren't used to getting out there. So I'll round it up to say, when I see like this stuff in Portland with the leaf blowers and stuff, I'm you know, I haven't necessarily read anything, and I don't know all the answers. Every time I talk to folks like you, I'm like, man, that's something I didn't think about. But it is, that part is encouraging, because there's just such a gulf of basic everyday experience that we have to bridge before we can even start having the conversations. So that's what I would start with, and what comes up for me. What do you think, Kassandra?
Thanks, Roman. I mean, for me, I think what's really interesting about this moment is that when we're having the conversation about police and policing, and we're having the conversation among different racial groups, I think the thing that's important to recognize is that white safety is built on Black subjugation, right? And so it's like, in order for white neighborhoods to be safe, right, they have created this dichotomy that all the policing has to happen in communities of color, right? And you can connect that based in the way that you see gentrification happening. When you're seeing certain neighborhoods turning over, you're seeing the over policing so the development can come so they can move out the communities that are there. And so I think part of the conversation, when you ask the question about how do we navigate the racism built into the institution, in order for us to actually acknowledge that, we need to blow up the idea of what public safety is. Because the idea, when we're talking, we have to have a conversation about what's safety versus what's discomfort, because those two things are often conflated. And then everyone uses public as if that's a shared understanding. And to be very clear, public means white, right? And safety means the subjugation of Black communities. And it means, and it has to be done without making white communities with access and money discomfort, right? Like, they can't be uncomfortable. They have to feel like they can walk in the space. And that means erasing all the things that make up the complexity of humanity, right? That's why you're seeing conversations of like homeless sweeps in certain neighborhoods in places like San Francisco, right? When we're having conversations about gentrification, that is also often connected with the fact that this neighborhood was divested from. There were no resources there. They tend to have, some of the things of like drug use, open air drug markets, public drug use, homelessness. And that is not a signal of a dilapidated people. That is a signal of a dilapidated governing body, right? That is a symbol of divestment. And so when they decide to invest in order to get the safety, they have to subjugate the people that are broke and the people that are not white. And so a lot of that is in order for us to actually invest in a model around safety, then we have to actually have a conversation about what safety means and who the public is. And so when we have conversations about this current moment and the uprisings, I'm encouraged because it shows that public education and political education work. If you look at how people felt about Black Lives Matter 7 years ago versus how they feel about it now, they understand it because we kept talking about it, right? And there are many people, especially in the drug policy movement, that didn't think that message was effective. They wanted us to say something else, right? They felt like it was too in your face. We're having that same conversation right now when we're talking about defunding the police. People are they feel that language is too strong, but they also felt like Black Lives Matter was strong. And I think what's really important is for us to be really clear about what it is that we need. And the fact is that for a very long time, organizations like LEAP and organizations like Drug Policy Alliance have talked about why drugs are not a policing issue and that they are a health issue. And that's different than a medicalization issue, right? So there's a lot of pieces that we have to pull apart. And so this moment of uprising for me shows that we need to continue giving people political education, understanding or letting people recognize that there are more options than what they're being given, because that when people get a multitude of options, they pick different things. And so that is what's super encouraging. And I will say, to Roman's point, it is quite encouraging to see white folks, white moms, doing all that protest. And I also say it's eerily familiar to the overdose crisis and the fact that it is white moms who said they lost their kids, and then there was the marshaling and the kind of sanitizing of the moment. And I think it's really important for folks like us to not give cookies to white moms who 2 weeks ago called the cops on people like Ahmaud Arbery, right? And so like it's okay to come into the moment where you come into it, but be accountable for where you were before.
Yes, I totally agree. Let's not give cookies for people just being decent people. And I love that you brought up public safety, because ultimately in the policing framing, public safety is about protecting whiteness and property, right? So I definitely think that's something to unpack. I also want to turn to the conversation about the drug war, right? Because I feel like there's a myth that releasing non-violent drug offenders will ultimately end mass incarceration. And I was looking at a report by the Prison Policy Initiative, and they were saying that drug offenses account for 500,000 incarcerated people and 1 million police arrests on average. So that said, would it be correct to say that ending prohibition is an easy way to defund police, or is it more complicated than that?
So, ending drug prohibition is a beginning. I think it is a handful of pieces of public policy that, if we enacted upon, go a long way in moving us to a place of police deconstruction. The vast majority of what police do today and have been doing for decades is about drug prohibition. It is about enforcing those laws. Again, the prohibition policy in and of itself, just like with alcohol prohibition back in the 1920s and early 30s, was the foundation for a lot of corruption and crime, and so it goes beyond of causing police action, in enforcing those policies, and and going after the users and the people selling the products, but it creates how can I say it, a perfect playing field for other types of crime to grow, and not just the crime that is obvious that we see within our neighborhoods, but within our political framework. Again, as I said, the corruption that goes with that. And so if we were to if we were to end prohibition, right off the bat, the police would be looking for something to do with all the men and women and money that they had, right? Because again, as I said, we spend so much of these police resources on that. It would then enable us to, I think, do what we should have been doing and what we're talking about doing now, with investing in our communities, within the Black community. Some refer to it as reparations for the Black community, which I tend to agree with, right? Because of the carnage from these policies and the enforcement of these policies in our neighborhoods, from the criminalization of Black folks to the redlining issues, to the creation of the so-called ghettos, to the dysfunction within our economic systems within our communities, to education, to health. And you will hear me say time and time again that, well, let me just say something real quick, because Kassandra, you made me think of something. When we're talking about, and you said public safety, we, Black folks within our communities, need to define what public safety is, what it means for us. Then once we do that and do the things to support that within our neighborhoods and our communities, then we'll see if and what that need for any type of policing entity looks like, if at all. So again, and that would be that when we redefine public safety for us within our communities, it would definitely be absent drug prohibition policies. And I think with that, I think we would, well, maybe some of us wouldn't be, but I think a lot of white folks and others would be surprised of what that would look like on the other side, and just how far that could go in changing the whole public safety paradigm and economic picture and more within many of our communities.
Yeah, thank
and
you.
health
And
is a big part of that, of course.
and, you know, when you said the part about Black people, we have to reimagine what public safety means for us. That kind of brought up in my head what Mariam Kaba says a lot, is that we need hyper-local organizing. And to me, that means we need folks to really take back our communities and really talk to each other, talk to your neighbors, talk to the business owners. Like, I think the policing state has made it so that we aren't like that, and we need to get back in alignment with one another.
Exactly. I would also say, to add to this question around would ending prohibition be like akin to like defunding the police. I think what this moment shows us is that drug policy people have to take their head out of the sand. I think we, as a movement, and even our movements are segmented and siloed, right? Like, it's the psychedelic people, it's the marijuana people, it's the harm reduction people, it's the sovereignty people, right? It's the racial justice people. Like, our movement is siloed. And what I'm about to say is that the drug policy movement in general needs to take its head out of the sand. That if we're actually going to commit to defunding the police, that we do actually have to care about homelessness, right? If we care about defunding the police, then we are going to have to talk about mental health. If we're talking about defunding the police, we are going to have a conversation about people who commit harm, right? And that we're going to have to talk about guns. We're going to have to talk about gangs. We are going to have to talk about many things, because ending the drug war will not end mass incarceration. And ending drug prohibition will not be enough to defund the police in the way that is meaningful as a step to abolition. And so it is this moment where I find that sometimes people come into this space and this is their movement. We're doing drug policy. This is racial justice. This is autonomy. This is gender. This is everything. And then put on blinders to what the larger society is. And then we tell ourselves lies about how important we are. Right? And the thing is that we are important. It is true. We are not the most important in the room. We are not the leading issue in the room, because none of them are. This is a force multiplier situation. The system is so insidious and so invasive that in order for us to actually get to where we are trying to go, and for me, that is a place without police, where communities are able to define what safety is and do that for themselves, and that and that people are not wanting for things because those things are provided, then we're going to have to talk to each other. And we don't even talk to each other in the drug policy movement. This is literally, we can't have conversations because we haven't agreed to the world that we're trying to get to. And when I say that, people will be like, we're going to end the war on drugs and, decrim insert whatever drug you want, but they aren't doing anything on the overdose crisis, or they don't see the overdose crisis as part of their work. Or someone is working on, cannabis legalization, but they don't see the over-militarization in Mexico and the aerial crop spraying in Colombia as part of their work. And so this moment for me about our movement is for us to get our head out of the sand, for us to actually look around and build a comprehensive strategy together, because we might have all our own stuff that we care about. Like, I have the right to have a preference about the thing that I'm most excited about in the movement. But if you want to say that you are part of the drug policy movement, then that means it has to be movement. That you recognize that your issues affect other issues, and that we have to actually be working in tandem and not cutting each other off and not doing things that disrupt the community, and being responsible to that. Because the thing that's important about this moment, and the thing that I have learned, is that drug policy can be moving forward, and then immigration gets super retroactive, right? Like, their pendulum swings completely the other way. And then the work that we've done has exacerbated the things that they're working on. And to be very clear, drug laws were an immigration policy, period. They started off as an immigration policy. They were an immigration tactic to criminalize groups of people that were not American, that were not white. So we need to build movement accountability for us to actually get to a place where we can defund the police. And we don't even do it within our movement. And so I would say no. If we're doing the work that we're doing right now, ending prohibition right now in the way that we would do it would not defund the police in a meaningful way if we're not going to be accountable to that. Because we will defund the police for marijuana possession, but not do anything for cocaine. We will work to decrim psilocybin, but not work to decriminalize heroin. And we say, let's only decriminalize this drug and not all the others, right? And so there's a conversation here to be had with our movement when we're talking about criminalization, because some people in our movement like to use the trope of criminalization as a reason for them to be in the space, but are not committed to actually ending criminalization just for the thing that they want to do.
Yes. And I love how you tie together the immigration to drug policy, because that's one of the first things I learned coming into the drug policy space is that, opium was used to criminalize Chinese immigrants, cocaine was used to criminalize Black people, and cannabis was used to criminalize Mexican immigrants. And to me, that's so important because we still see, again, immigrants, particularly Black immigrants, being deported at higher rates for things like drug charges. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Well, you can get real deep on that. I mean, going to your initial point, I'm just riffing off of you, Kassandra. This country now, perhaps the most important agreement that we all have to reach in this country and be safe to say and call a spade is that this country has been set up to protect and preserve the comfort, safety, security, legality of whiteness, right? And whether it's criminalizing language for indigenous folks, criminalizing dress, criminalizing dances, criminalizing spiritual behavior, which goes right into cultural behavior, substances, the whole thing is an architecture. So it's a good time, I think, to get deep on these things, because if you start too far down the line, like with this is my issue, then you'll mess up and you'll end up by furthering one thing, you're stigmatizing others. We have to keep our minds on the ball that it is criminalization as we understand it as an assumption in this country that is a problem. I want to live in a country where no one is a criminal, okay? I want to live in a country where an arrest is a failure, not a success. When I worked in Oakland, I remember they were looking at bringing on a new bringing on a new police chief. And one of the people who I was hoping would become police chief there, deputy chief said, I've been working for years just to change our internal policy where essentially an arrest is like your arrest rate is your success rate. And maybe, Neil, you have something about that. But that may sound benign. You don't necessarily, that's not the sexiest thing to say. But when you think about the architecture here, where in police departments across the country, that's still, maybe there's been some chips around that, chinks around the armor or whatever, but ultimately, just like with prosecutors, if your conviction rate, if the severity of your plea rate is your success, every you're a hammer, everything's going to be a nail. We have certain assumptions that are deep-seated that we've glorified through media, and which can be propaganda, that this is just how life is. There's criminals, there's cops and robbers, there's bad people doing bad things, there's people, and when something goes wrong, someone needs to be punished and go to jail. We need to eradicate violence, state violence, and interpersonal violence from our neighborhoods, which is exacerbated and promulgated by the neighborhood violence, gun violence, exacerbated and promulgated and encouraged by state violence. The top down influences the bottom up, right? We need to build a world where violence is extracted from both of those things, from our systems and from our neighborhoods, from where we all understand that no one is a criminal, okay? Where we understand that an arrest is a failure. There's other ways to do law enforcement. We take these things for granted, that we take stop and frisk. We take the fact that if someone's doing something wrong, I guess I have to arrest them, spending all these resources, book them, take them away from their families. They're losing their jobs. They're internalizing a narrative that I am a criminal. This is my place in society. And we all have, in this call, and all of you people listening, all have a relative degree, probably many of you have a relative degree of privilege. You know, yes, I've been racially stigmatized and harmed in my life, but I do not live day to day with the constant specter that I don't have freedom, right? Because at any moment, I mean, I was talking to a youth yesterday. They know in DC, as young as 9 and 10, that when they see a police car, they got to lift their waistbands. I mean, just imagine that. So we got to get deep. We have to use these moments. We as, you know, we have to say the things, you know, like Kassandra said, Black Lives Matter. What does that mean? It was only until very recently that we even sort of agreed as a society that Black people could have nice things, you know, period. Look at the way neighborhoods are set up. So it can be overwhelming because there's a lot of things that have to happen simultaneously, but we need these organizing principles to understand, oh, wow, these are the assumptions that make it all seem so difficult. Well, if every police department set out today and saying, okay, an arrest is a failure, let's roll our sleeves up and figure out whether it's citations, whether it's whatever else that a lot of other countries are doing, by the way. If it's a nonviolent encounter, why does there need to be an arrest? Unless there's an emergency, even now, that would cut down on probably a majority of that initial interaction, which is what causes so much of the violence in the first place on the street level. So, but Neil, you tell me, man, how do we get our police departments to take this on?
So, they may not be the ones that make that decision. Probably shouldn't be the ones that make that decision. But let me just point out a couple of things that you said. You know, when you have a group of people that want to see themselves as the good, what do you need for that? You need the opposite end of that, right? You need the evil, right? Legislating morality is where we are. This is what it's all about. Whether we're talking about drug policy, whether we're talking about sex work, whether we're talking about being houseless, whether you're all of this stuff, you know, as you put it, the failures, right? What do we classify as a failure? And then we criminalize what we believe to be failure, which is more times than not immorality, right? You don't line up with my morality. So therefore, we put legislation in place that criminalizes that behavior that doesn't line up with my sense of morality. You know, even when you talk about citations, first of all, the police shouldn't be involved in any type of civil process whatsoever. When we talk about citations, even the imbalance we have there, right? Because you have $100 fine for a particular offense, and then the second offense is $200. In many of our communities in our cities, who can pay that, right? And then what happens when you can't pay that? So there has to, if you're going to have a process, even if that's a step toward where we want to be, you know, maybe it's not all the way where we want to be, but maybe it's a step. Okay, we're moving from criminalizing a behavior to, you know, issuing a citation. So we're no longer arresting, but we're handing out a citation. There has to be balance there, right? So if I have no income, okay, what would I have to do to satisfy the citation that I just received? And it has to be something reasonable. But if you have income, okay, maybe that whatever you pay is relative to that income that you are making. So if I'm a billionaire, maybe my fine is $20 million or whatever that case may be. And that $20 million can go into a community. But anyway, these things just to demonstrate that we need a whole new paradigm and regarding these issues that we're talking about, the way we criminalize behavior, the way our criminal justice system works, doesn't work. I think we're at a moment right here and right now with the attention that we have, where things have just gotten to a point with the murder of George Floyd. It's not just about George Floyd, it's everything that has led up to this point. But we're at a critical moment in time that I believe is going to be a very short and brief window where we need to make the best of it in completely redesigning a major part of society and what we do and how we go about things. And it's going to take these conversations like what we're having here, but after the conversations, then where are we and what do we do and how do we further it? The things that are discussed, again, redefining, public safety and health within the Black community. We got to have these conversations about reparations for, getting many of these communities so that we're no longer into gentrification, but we're actually making a community beyond livable for the people who currently live there, so that they can actually thrive economically, health-wise, environmental health, Kassandra, mental health, all these things that are important to a thriving community. I don't think we should limit our conversations and our work at this time to reform and defunding the police and whatever. I think we need to make dramatic change in any and every place that we can while we have this moment. And Kassandra, I agree with you 100% about those of us in this drug policy world and the infighting that we have. Well, my drug is safer than your drug. It's bullshit. Drugs are neither good or bad. It's all about the environment that we establish for them to be used in, right? We all, so for the drug policy folks, yes, we got to come together and figure out what's the end game here. What is the ultimate? And that's what we need to be looking for, not 2 years down the road where everybody can smoke weed freely. No, we have a moment here where we can do and change any damn thing we want. And a big piece of this, obviously, is the race part, right? It's central to a lot of what's happening and what has happened over the past few hundred years in this country. And I'm just talking about this country, but I'll put a pin in it right there for now and let you guys take it.
No, thank you, Neil. Thank you. I want to just kind of get back to your point of this is a moment where we can make a big change. And in a lot of online discussions, I'm seeing people kind of confuse and conflate abolishing the police versus defunding. Me personally, I kind of see defunding as a first step to abolishing police. But I want to hear from you guys, your thoughts on that. And then also, I see discussions online where people are like, oh, well, let's replace cops with social workers. And that sounds, for those of us who don't have experience dealing with the social work field, that might sound like cool and stuff, but you also need to look at the history of social work and see that that is another arm of policing. And so I just wanted to address those 2 points. If you guys could talk about, how you see defunding fitting into abolishment. And Kassandra, I know you got your master's in social work, so I wanted you specifically to speak to that that whole sentiment of like, oh, let's replace cops with social workers.
So I think to your first point, I absolutely believe that you cannot separate defunding from abolition, and that defunding is about removing resources from law enforcement and into other supports. Is very much a divest, invest strategy, or it should be, because it's like you just can't defund the thing that is responding right now. And then what happens then, right? So you say, we don't want them to do this anymore. So we actually have to build the thing that we want. And that can be investing in other resources or investing in communities. And so I think it's important. And I think, a lot of people are really scared about this idea about not having police. And I think I think there are a lot of reasons why this is really hard for us. So much of our socialization has placed law enforcement as a necessary entity in our lives. And so many people have conflated the idea that communities will not be safe without law enforcement. But there are so many communities right now that do not have a heavy law enforcement presence that are safe, or by the means that people might see it, right? And so I think there's a conversation when you think about for yourself, like, when is the time I feel most safe, which is what a lot of reformer, like justice community organizers do. Like when they tell people, close your eyes, think about the time you felt most safe. Most people aren't thinking about law enforcement there, right? And so it's having that conversation about, like, what does safety mean? It's like the person that you love that gives you hugs, right? And I think it's also about really being understanding that people will commit harm. And it's about, how do we address that harm? How do we hold that harm? And how do we reduce the likeliness of that harm happening again? And so that this conversation about defunding, this conversation about abolition is about preparation. And it's about understanding human nature. And what are the things that we can do that make the things that we're fighting right now more abnormal, right? And so I think the other thing is understanding that I think that the thing that is hard for society right now is talking about the scary people, the people that do things that we think are unimaginable, are never to be forgiven. And I think that we have a lot to learn from folks that are in sexual violence, folks that are dealing with violence, because there are people who are doing this work where they are working to build and deal with those harms outside of a carceral actor like law enforcement. And I want to be really clear, we're not going to get there tomorrow. And we have to be responsible about that and have the conversations now about what is needed for us to get there. But I think the thing that we can't do is stop the conversation because we're scared of this thing, because we don't see the way. And the thing that I will make relatable to right now is when we have conversations about legalizing all drugs, right? We have to have a conversation about, what are we going to do with drug trade organizations, right? The organizations that are killing people, that are kidnapping people right now. How do we have that conversation? Because ending the drug war is not going to be enough to deal with the totality of the harm that is done, right? So we do actually have to talk about El Chapo. We do actually have to talk about the drug trade organizations, right? And we have to have very serious conversations about what that looks like. And honestly, that conversation has to start with the survivors of the harm. So we need to be having conversations with the people who are living in these countries and in these cities that are being overtaken by militarized police and fortified drug trade organizations, and say, what do you want? What do you think can start helping to repair the harm that has happened to you? And then the thing around social workers is understanding that the institution of police is not solely about police. Social work is built on stealing indigenous children and bringing them to white families. Okay? I'm raised in a Catholic, like, missionaries and religious organizations are policing different kinds of people through language and what they do, what they put in their body, who they have love with, everything. Multiple institutions are policing institutions. And that this conversation is not just about defunding the police where I live, NYPD. It's defunding and dismantling the idea that we should police each other. That policing is the verb that we are connected to. How can we do something else to navigate disagreement? Social workers are dangerous. I consider social workers cops. They take kids away. They tell you whether or not you can have certain medication. They tell you whether or not the things that are happening in your mind are real or not. we have to really figure out what does autonomy mean for ourselves and how do we affirm people's humanity. And anyone that is put in the position to regulate another person's humanity is someone that is able to police you. And that we actually have to have that conversation. And so when we're talking about medicalization of drugs, we are inviting policing into our community in a different way. But police is police is police. And so just because you change the actor doesn't mean you change the action. And so some people were like, well, I would rather a doctor versus a cop. Say that to all the Black women that die every day giving birth. Because they are policing the pain, they are policing their actions. And what has been led to is that in this country, Black women are most likely to die giving birth, the thing that we have always been doing. And that is what happens when we allow policing. Stop with the hands. That is why that's what happens when we allow policing to get into our space.
Yes, yes. And I love that you brought up the medicalization because I think in some of our earlier conversations, we were talking about how that model is being used for psychedelics. And, there's a lot of issues there. First, there's a lack of like POC practitioners for that. And then there's, like you said, it invites more policing into our lives. So I wanted to also just, invite Roman and Neil, if you guys have something to say about abolishing versus defunding. How do you foresee this happening? And it kind of also takes me back to our other conversation when Roman was saying, oh, well, I think, what was your question, Roman? You were saying something like, how quickly can we end prohibition? And we were like all saying like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I personally think 20 plus years because, right, as I said before, we're still dealing with marijuana prohibition, even though we have it legalized in a lot of states. On a federal level, it still hasn't changed, right? So what steps do you see as a part of ending prohibition?
Right. Well, I don't know if Neil was going to take this. I mean, I was going to riff on, I really liked when we framed it in those concrete terms. I was sort of going to speak to this whole, for me, we talked about how long would it take to end prohibition, but also, I guess that was the question. And again, from my lens, right, like how long will it take to legalize cannabis? Well, we've already done it, or like, but really, have we done it? And like, what does it mean, like, to liberate versus just legalize and all these things, right? So that can become a very philosophical question. What I'm thinking about is from what Kassandra was saying about the social work industrial complex, which touches on, again, the fact that so many of our architectures and our professions are built on the same set of insidious assumptions. And I'll keep going back to that. And that said, I work with a relatively newer program idea of having, now we're in a paradigm or emerging paradigm of like alternatives to policing being violence interrupters, credible messengers, people from the neighborhoods that are being impacted by over-policing, by marginalization, by the drug war, folks from those neighborhoods, and basically doing things. Neil mentioned reparations. Some people see this as a form of reparation, but basically training folks, a lot of times folks who have long rap sheets, who are returning citizens, if they choose to identify that way, to resource them to be involved in a healthier way and to take on their own healing and training into the field of working with their own communities to prevent violence, to intervene, use mediation tactics, use restorative justice tactics, use their own, neighborhood specific, organic, emergent tactics to just become involved in a healthier way in their communities thriving and, again, extracting violence. So that's something. And I guess to answer your question, this is a roundabout way of like the point I'm trying to make is there are ways that are being experimented with for alternatives to policing, and they're imperfect, right? Which goes to your question about prohibition. How long would it take? Well, gosh, like it's almost like even if everybody's acting right, we are traumatized from the past 400 years and the past 100 years of intense sort of federal drug policy prohibition, for example. So it takes time for particularly severely traumatized communities to adjust, I think, and our own norms to adjust as well. Kassandra pointed to a host of issues, or she opened the door to a host of issues like what would it take to trust the edifice of social work? What are the things we would need to do to start trusting that again? And with the violence interrupters, there's a lot of toxicity in other ways and other issues that come up with trying to work with folks who have had dysfunctional lifestyles, who have had, who are grappling with toxic masculinity. We have men's circles and things like that. We are learning to detoxify ourselves so that we can actually serve in a healthy way, and it's imperfect. So I think you guys know more about the policy reasons why it might take 2 generations, 3 generations to, end prohibition. I am not a drug policy expert, so you guys should talk about that. But I think from a normative sort of communal cultural standpoint, everything is connected, and you can't disconnect our norms about and our policy. All these things need to happen at the same time. So our norms about masculinity, for example, and leadership, what it means to be of service, what the goals are for someone being of service to their community, we need to heal those norms because those things have also been traumatized by, ultimately, someone said, the system of governments, the societal forces, the powers that have gone into shaping our dysfunctional, marginalized communities. We need to, as we gain sovereignty, remember and emerge with healthier norms that are both old, coming back, because now they're allowed to come back again in a healthy way, and we don't have everybody who's completely a mental health wreck because they have to work 10 jobs and they can't care for their children and all these things. So, but also new things, right? Because we're always going forward as society too, and this society does not look the same way as it did when Indigenous folks were first forced onto agencies and Black folks first came up from the Great Migration. We are here now. We are in segregated modern urban centers now. We're in a society where Indigenous folks have been under-resourced and their culture has been stripped away and forced to conform to a capitalistic Western mindset. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I thought I'd say a word about some of the challenges of alternatives to policing, external challenges like funding, but also internal challenges like the cultural work, finding our own way, making sure we have the space from our funders, from our local government to do that work. And so that the program doesn't just get cut after 1 year because they don't see the successes that they think they want to see. So that's the kind of world that I'm in personally with all this. But I'd love to hand it over to you all to talk more about prohibition policy in general to answer how long it's going to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that about the cultural change, because I think, especially policy people, we tend to focus on that. And we also have to understand there's a lot of cultural change and unpacking and stigma that we also have to undo. Yeah.
So, ending prohibition. You find a way for people who are making the money now from prohibition, find a way for them to make money on the other side. It'll happen tomorrow. It's all about money. It really is. Alcohol prohibition didn't take forever. They had enough of it. They passed an amendment to repeal the 18th Amendment. It was done. And you know what? It found its way, right? Regulatory models came from one state to the next, and they still change today. As they try to improve it, or as people try to make more money from selling alcohol and booze. But again, just take marijuana, for instance. You remove it from the scheduling system at the federal, and it's done. It's done. The states will do whatever they want to do. They'll have the freedom to do whatever they want to do, and it will change from day to day. It'll continue to change and morph. It's all about the political groundswell that we can create to get it done, and again, it's all about economics. And I'll leave that at that, and I'll be honest with you, who knows how long it's going to take? I mean, nobody knows. If I knew, I don't know, I'd be a billionaire right now. As far as the defunding, deconstruction of policing, I think the way to go forward is, I think we need a model. We need take a city like Louisville or whatever, Baltimore, whatever, and just start doing what we're talking about right here, right? In investing, what can we do? And you don't have to start with everything all at once, but having the conversations. So what are those things that we can do within our neighborhoods? Roman, you mentioned violence interrupters. These folks do great work. Give them the funding, give them the resources that they need, right? We don't have to be funding these major nonprofit organizations that come into these cities to do this and do this massive study on this, that, and the other, dumping millions of dollars into these organizations. No, go into these neighborhoods and the credible messengers you mentioned, right? These folks who have been there, have been incarcerated, come back out to the neighborhood and have tremendous influence over these young people. Give them the money and resources that they need. The people who are doing the work in the streets with our sex workers, give them the money and resources that they need. So many wonderful things being done. So the first thing you do is you start supporting them and bolstering them up, right? You start working on environmental health, right? You start working on shoring up at the micro level within our neighborhoods, good educational programs for our young people, doing those things that truly support and embrace the mothers within these communities, the people who are returning home from being incarcerated. The community figuring out, again, what is important, what's going to make a difference to them, and then you start supporting that in the proper way. And I think very soon you will see that, well, we don't need this from the police anymore. We don't need that from the police anymore. Kassandra mentioned mental health. You know what? Don't need the police. Hell, when someone calls because their child is tearing up the house, but they're not, they're not going out shooting people. They're tearing up the living room. You know what? The police aren't coming. Somebody else is coming who is skilled and qualified. Maybe it's not a social worker, but who is skilled and qualified in dealing with that type of situation. We need to ask those questions. Who is the person? Who are the people? Who are the ones that care? Who are the ones that can make a difference doing all of this? The restorative justice models that are out there, transformative justice models that are out there for the people that we are afraid of, the people that have maybe hurt other people, right? How do you stop that, right? And we've heard the saying, hurting people hurt other people, right? How do you heal people? What's the way to do that? As we start that process of chipping away at these things in a given community, then we'll start to see that we need less and less and less from our police. And before you know it, well, we don't need that $30 million. We don't need, all these marked undercover police cars and all this militarized equipment, because we don't have that issue or problem. So you start rediverting those funds, and now you're no longer arresting and incarcerating so many people. You're sending people home. You know how much money we spend in corrections? You know how much money we spend in our detention centers? Just start the process and keep the process going for changing health within our communities, for changing what we consider safety within our communities. As I said, maybe it's just a hug, right? That's what makes people, what does it take to make people feel safe? Just start the process, and we'll see where we end up at the end of the day. And I think at the end of the day, what we're really all looking forward to is the abolition of our police.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that you said start the process, because what I'm finding in a lot of these discussions is that people are struggling with imagining a world without police. They can literally just not get their imagination to get there. And so to me, I'm just like, just take one step. Like, just take one step. Like, why are we so afraid to just take one step towards that direction? I think it speaks to how much like we cling on to these ideas that are totally false a lot of time. So I see that as one of the cultural barriers to defunding the police, like helping people imagine a world without it. But I specifically want to hear from Kassandra and Neil, and Roman too, if you want to, about what other barriers do you see in your work and just in your everyday life around defunding the police and ending prohibition too.
I just want to say one thing real quick, and Kassandra, then you take it. Politically right now, and don't get me wrong, we need the things that we're calling for. The chokehold restrictions, qualified, eliminate that, dealing with the power police unions and all this stuff. The pieces of legislation that we're seeing at the federal level and at the state level that's being put out there and passed. But I think there's so much political emphasis on that, it's preventing us from thinking about what we just talked about, starting the process, right? Of the things that truly matter and going to make a long time sustaining difference in our communities. Don't get me wrong, we need those pieces of legislation, but you know what? We can do that and we can do the other stuff too at the same time. It's not just one or the other. So let's just make sure we do all of that at the same time, and not have that attention being that we're placing on these individual pieces of legislation be a distraction from the things that are truly going to make sustaining, progress and difference in our communities. Go ahead, Kassandra.
I think a stumbling block that I see is that folks don't actually believe that investing in things like housing is safety, that that's a strategy, right? That actually giving people cash assistance is a strategy. That giving people access to healthcare is a health strategy. And I think so much of it is tied up in our cultural trope around you need to work for everything you have. And this commitment to capitalism. And I think that, it's so interesting to watch capitalism grip our movement. And how, despite the fact that the drug trade is an extension of capitalism, that we don't effectively take that into consideration as a part of what we need to end when we end the drug war. And we see the fact that we ignore that in our movement space. We see it with cannabis, and we see it with psychedelics, right? We see it with opiates and the big pharma. We see that capitalism is violent in the way that drug trade organizations are holding whole communities hostage, right? And, Deborah Peterson Small is, one of the gods in the space. And she often talks about the drug of sugar and what the world did for sugar, and what the world did for cotton. And what they did was they stole every single person on this screen. They stole us. None of us, not Neil, not Roman, not Ife, not me, should be in this Western Hemisphere. We are a product of the drug war. Us being on the Western Hemisphere is a product of the drug war. The drugs of sugar and spice and cotton. They created a whole transatlantic slave trade to steal black
tobacco now
from the continent of Africa. Oh, tobacco, right? They stole us, literally stole us to push substances. And it is, I think it's infuriating that we have missed the role of capital in the drug war, and that we actually don't have a strategy for it. And we know we don't have a strategy for it because in the psychedelic community, y'all are arguing with indigenous communities about their own medicine.
Talk about it.
And saying, no, this is for all. Y'all saying this is for everybody. This is for everybody. I don't understand how people out here Christopher Columbusing as if we have not stolen enough already, that we are in this moment and we are not actually examining the reason why Black people are on this Western Hemisphere, that it happened per chance. We are here based on circumstance, the circumstance of capital and slavery, and the policing of our bodies, the policing of what we were supposed to do, the idea that we had to work, not work so we can thrive and provide for our families, that we had to work to make money for the people that captured us. And all of that, to me, is the barrier that our movement is not reckoning, because we're only reproducing it in what we believe is the end of prohibition, but which is the furthering of capitalism and the reinforcement of capital as something that is able to be exploited and extracted from communities all around this world.
Amazing. I love that you brought up what Deborah Peterson Small says, because that's such an amazing frame of understanding the place of capital in the drug war. But I want to pivot a little bit. We're going to get to Q&A really soon. So guys in the audience, if you have questions, make sure you use the ask a question function so we can get your questions in before we start Q&A. I want to pivot a little bit because, we're all here in the States, but I want to see more of a connection between defunding the police and defunding our military. Right? We have a very expansive, well-funded military force that has bases all over the world. And then, I was just thinking about, I was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened, and we waged a war against Iraq and Afghanistan, where millions of people have died and millions of people have been displaced. And on top of that, we also have our exported drug laws that are very punitive, that a lot of other countries have taken on and used as an excuse to literally execute people. So how do we connect our struggles of defunding the police here in the States to defunding the international police, aka our military, and other harmful regimes like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, who's killing thousands and thousands of people in the name of the drug war?
Well, I think it goes back to that money thing. Military industrial complex, it's a lot of money is being made through arms sales. Hell, we're still in the business of colonizing. You know, that's what we do. That's why we're in so many other places around the globe. At the end of the day, it is about money. You know, it is about those lobbying our so-called representatives in D.C. on the Hill. Right? It is about the contractors that continue to make millions and billions of dollars doing this. War is big business, and this country here is probably well, it definitely is the largest business ever to exist. And if you look at the history of policing, you go back to, let's see, Berkeley, California, August Vollmer, who was chief of police out there. I think he was the first head of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the ICP. And that's when we really started started making this transition to being this quasi-military force and operation, right? I mean, the history of policing is really interesting regarding this country. Again, as I mentioned, slave patrols, protection of property, so on. But then we got into this place of this military structure within policing and how we operate. And now we're to the point that we're taking military equipment through the 1033 program, you know, free MRAPs, free tanks, free grenade launchers, whatever they have, you want it, you can get it. We had started to roll that program back under Obama, but now it's free flowing again. And we're trying to make changes there yet again, to restrict the amount and the types of military equipment that can fall into the hands of our police departments around the country. And we see, I mean, it's unfolding right before us today as to what can happen when police have this type of equipment. If they have it, they're going to use it, and they're going to use it against us in a number of different ways. But again, and I want to say something. There's a friend of mine who was, we got into this really, really deep conversation about guns and the proliferation of guns in our country. And he was arguing with me about, well, let's go after the gun manufacturers to force them to stop making guns. If we stop them from making guns, then you know what? Eventually we can start getting rid of guns. All right. You got to stop war first, right? War is the main reason gun manufacturers are in business right now. So until we are able to stop war, the guns are going to be made, folks. And I'll pause right then and there. And guns are big business. Yeah, we talk about the Second Amendment, but guns are big business.
Ife, I really thank you for this point. I've been thinking about it since we talked about it in the prep, because I have not always thought that I've had the most developed analysis around defunding the military industrial complex. But what actually I realize is that if we want to actually end the war on drugs, we actually do have to end. We do have a stake in ending the military industrial complex, because so much of our military and those monies are used to militarize other police forces and militaries around the country, in the name of the war on drugs. We send so much money to militarizing other police forces around the country, around the world, that inherent in us working to defund the police in the name of ending the drug war, we actually have to defund the military in the name of the drug war as well. And I say that especially as someone who's from the Caribbean, and we know the role that the U.S. plays in exporting their policies to the Caribbean, and specifically, and the way that they have funded the policing in those countries. And, you know, how are countries getting such high grade equipment is through the funding of the United States. And so as we have the conversation, and I think this is a valid critique of the US drug policy movement, is that we often see our movement as insular. And so we focus the harms of the drug war in the context of the United States, sometimes ignoring the role that our policies have outside of the US and being accountable to that, because we're fighting here for, defund the police, but we also need to be like, and we don't want our government funding the drug war in other countries and the militarization that also comes with that. And so it's great. Thank you so much for elevating that, because I think that is often missing in our discussion. And so many people around the world need us to actually get that part right, because if we end the drug war in the United States, but don't end it in other parts of the world, we didn't end the drug war. And it goes back to what I said earlier about how public safety in this country is based on the idea that you keep white people safe by harming and subjugating communities of color. You keep America safe by subjugating other countries around the world, especially those that are non-white. And so it is very much the same kind of thesis that is extracted globally. And so it's really important for us to be in partnership with our allies around the world for us to actually do something that also impacts them as well.
And you keep the international community safe by funding the capitalist growth economic model that is destroying the planet.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn to Q&A, I promise, but I did want to get one last question in, particularly about Elijah McClain. He was a young Black man who was murdered in Colorado after being given a large dose of ketamine. And a lot of you guys know in the audience that ketamine has a lot of therapeutic values, particularly for helping folks with depression. So I want to kind of talk about the role that psychedelics play in law enforcement. There's been a history of the CIA, FBI using psychedelics for various experiments. And then there's also now law enforcement using things like ketamine to quote unquote subdue people. And thank you, Mike. Mike just added a statement from medical and mental health professionals on the use of ketamine by law enforcement. So I suggest everyone check that out. But I just wanted to see if folks had thoughts about that. What should psychedelic enthusiasts be doing to make sure that things like ketamine, things like LSD, and God knows what else aren't being used by law enforcement in this way?
So, so I'll be real brief. Whether LSD or ketamine or any of those, any drug, law enforcement shouldn't be in the business of using any of them. I mean, it's just not their area of expertise. Again, we're talking about moving in a completely different direction with law enforcement anyway. We're having a conversation about where law enforcement should and should not be within our communities, and the process of changing that. And I mean, right off the bat, this is not, law enforcement should not be able to give instruction to any paramedic, to any medical professional about what they should administer to anyone in our communities, period.
Right. As long as the substances are criminalized, it's law enforcement's, they exercise a privilege, an exclusive domain. So prohibition as a route to ending privileged access, in all sorts of ways, including law enforcement's privileged access.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that Elijah's case tragedy honestly gives us a window into what some of our mental health advocates are fighting against. Forced drugging is super popular for people that have serious mental illness, where they are in institutions where they are drugged against their will in the name of their health. And this is linked to the work that we do where, where we'll say people shouldn't be incarcerated. They should be given resources. They should be able to go to treatment. But that treatment is not coercive, right? And so we need to be really specific about what we need, especially as we build alternatives and especially as we invest resources from which we took out from a carceral resource to put into another carceral resource that could be treatment or medicalization. And so it's really important. I think the case around Elijah shows that they want to be able to use drugs on us when they can. And again, as Black people, we have that very particular history of being drugged or being accused of being under the influence as a way to control our bodies, as well as to provide justification and the propaganda about why we need to be policed in a certain way. And so I think for us, as we have conversations about the way that psychedelics are being used by law enforcement, it doesn't have to be the CIA, FBI. It's literally the mental health hospital that's down the block from you, right? And I think that's really important for us to also take into consideration that if we are talking about people elevating and getting to different planes and being able to use drugs to do that, to achieve that, there are some people that don't need drugs to do that. They are on a different plane naturally based on what their brain function is. And that we need to respect, just as you want people to respect your ability to go to a different plane, we need to respect the planes that people naturally get to. And we need to figure out how do we build a society that is conducive to that and doesn't try to drug people out of that or beat that out of people. And so I think the Elijah's death is important and is a rallying cry for us to be in better conversation with people around, not just around policing, but also what our siblings in the movement around mental health. Because, mental health and drug policy, they follow each other, right? That it's a chicken and an egg situation. Like, they do some fucked up shit over there, then we do some fucked up shit over here. We do some fucked up shit over here, then they do some fucked up shit over there. And so it's really important for us to build with folks in the mental health autonomy space to really have a conversation. Because if we're fighting for our autonomy to put whatever we want in our bodies, they need the autonomy to not have people put things in their bodies. And so I think it's really an opportunity for us to have a conversation together about forced drugging and the way that our movements collide. And I really want to name Catherine Celentano, who formerly of Drug Policy Alliance, longtime member of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, who really worked with me on my thinking about making the connections between them, both of them.
Yes, thank you. So we're pressed for time right now, so I'm gonna go ahead and move to Q&A. One of the top question comes from Renew. Hello. Renew's question is, concerning the decriminalized nature movement that has mushroomed over the past year, what steps do you think the psychonaut community should take to make sure that Indigenous Americans who originally used these plant medicines, like peyote, are ceremonially, Indigenous Americans who originally used these plant medicines ceremonially are centered. So what can the psychedelic community do to make sure that those Indigenous communities are centered when we talk about things like decrim nature? And I mean, I personally will say that, I read the peyote statement from the Decrim Nature and also the LA Times article that was interviewing a lot of Indigenous leaders. I'm just like, I respect people's cultural boundaries, and I understand something is not a part of my culture. I'm not really trying to fuck with it, you know? And I think that people need to understand that there are cultural boundaries, and that if you're going to be talking about people's medicines, you need to build a relationship with them. You can't do anything about them without them. So that's where I'll leave that.
So Ife, I think you just said it. I don't think our government has any say regarding what indigenous people were using for their ceremonial purposes. Therefore, there should not be a prohibition for them, which therefore means no need for decriminalization. Again, it is I think, an inalienable right that this country took from them. And not just in this country, but as we were talking earlier about how we exported our drug policies around the globe. We've affected so many other countries and indigenous people in so many other countries regarding the substances that they used historically for centuries, if not thousands of years, for their ceremonial purposes and reasons. And no one other than that group of folks has a right to dictate to them how and when and what they should use. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also think it's worth mentioning that peyote is in danger, right? It's not an easy thing to extract. It's not an easy thing to come across. So we also have to think of the environmental impacts of people really extracting these things for themselves without connecting to the culture behind it.
I also think we need to talk to indigenous communities in the United States, right? There is this, I think there is a focus on indigenous communities in South America, and I think that's important, and I think it's necessary, but I think it's strategic that some people go to South American countries to talk to folks, to indigenous folks, and don't talk to the indigenous folks in the United States, and we have to be honest about that.
Yeah, and you know, I think part of the reason, well, I'm not going to try to rationalize it, but we all know that Native American groups are severely impacted by the war on drugs. And that to me is connected to what Neil was saying, that colonization and that stripping away and criminalizing their cultural practices. So yeah, I totally agree.
You look, if you really want to, as Kassandra, as you said, police a people, right? What better way to do it than to screw with their and just for the say this word, for their cult, screw with their religious, to screw with their enlightening, right? Which, you know, and don't get me wrong, I'm not an expert when it comes to this. I don't claim to be, never will be, but them using their substances for enlightenment, right? There's no better way than to begin to police, to control a group of people, than to strip them of that. And that's what we do. That's one of the first things that the colonizers would do when they go into a community of people, is to strip them of what has made them special as a culture, and to think for themselves and to become enlightened, so you take away their guidance, their processes of guidance and direction, and then you have them.
Yes.
I can't, like, Neil, yes, because it's the same script that we keep doing over and over again. You take people away from their land, you take them away from their food, you take them away from their religion, you take them away from their rituals. And the thing that we have done is then we capitalize on it and then we sell it. And when you divorce things and divorce people from their land, from their rituals, and, you know, one of the things that's so interesting about navigating race is that nothing makes white people more mad than telling them that they can't have something.
Yep.
There are multiple things. When people say you can't use the N-word, when you say you can't, hip hop is ours, when we say dreads are ours, when we say like all these things make you very upset. Like you see all the like this is for everybody. This narrative that everything is for everybody and that we need to share and like you have to take. What are you bringing to the table?
Exactly. Yeah. So touching on that colonialism and imperialism thing, I think that Timothy's question is a little interesting, and we touched on this before, but Timothy basically asks, America exported the war on drugs to the world, and we in the Caribbean are a majority Black population. Our Coast Guards and police have been funded and trained by the USA. Can we address the war on drugs as an extension of colonialism, empire, and international racism?
Well, and again, we did it. We did it first here. You know, going back to you know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Police Force, which literally took the men from these tribal communities and put blue uniforms on them and said, now you have to police that relationship. Kassandra talked about earlier about when did it become policing? You know, why are we policing ourselves in this way? It's a project, it's an agenda. And suddenly you have a culture where this outside colonial project is using force in a program to cause a community to start policing itself in a different way than it was before, according to a different set of values and, of course, a harmful basis. So, you know, we did it here first. now we exported it all over the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go on to the next question. Thank you, Roman. What, if anything, do you see as the future for use of force in addressing public, community, individual needs around safety? It seems to me like people still see force as a simple go-to to address their fears of harm. That question comes from MW.
Could you repeat that one more time, Ife?
Sure. So the question is, what, if anything, do you see as the future for use of force in addressing public, community, individual needs around safety?
Sounds like a question for Kassandra to answer. Because no, here's why I say this, Kassandra. Typically, when we hear the term use of force, what do you think of? You think of police, right? You think of police making an arrest. You think of the police harm, police violence, and so on. But Kassandra, you just made me think of it differently just during this conversation. When you start talking about social work, right? When you started talking about you know, forcibly introducing medication into someone's body, right? If you know the many other ways that the government uses force against a people. So I think we have to go beyond what the police do and start thinking of it in a broader sense of the use of force and the harms and who and when and how and why it is. And I think that is important. That's an important conversation to have going forward with what we're talking about here, right? Just using this moment to think about how we can change so many things that are wrong with our society.
And that's exactly right, Neil. Miriam Kava says, oftentimes people show up for police violence when someone has died. And we only acknowledge the extremes of violence and harm and force. But I think about force around stop and frisk. That is a use of force. Throwing kids up against the wall, violating their personal space, putting your hands in their pockets against their will. That is force. I think about moms or parents who are people that give birth and them getting drug tested without their consent in the hospital during the most precious time. That is a use of force, right? The force of your power and control in that moment when they are helpless, right? And so I think, to your point, MW, I think we need to also challenge what we think force means and actually expand it, and to show that we have conceded the idea of intrusion in our lives, and we've desensitized the role that these actors are playing in intruding and limiting our ability to be ourselves and to walk and thrive in the world.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to move on to I'll take one last question. This comes, I believe this is Sunshine. How would Second Amendment rights play into the narrative on legalization and reevaluating public safety? I think a lot about the offender that also had a weapon present. Y'all want me to repeat that? Okay. So how would Second Amendment rights play into the narrative on legalization and reevaluating public safety? I think a lot about the offender that also had a weapon present.
I think this is why people in the drug policy space have to have the conversation about violent versus nonviolent and figure out how to disrupt that arbitrary line. And I say that because mere possession of a gun makes a possession arrest now violent. And I think if we are going to have adult rational conversations about drugs, then we have to talk about the fact that what are the conditions that prohibition creates? And people have guns when they're involved in the drug trade as a matter of protection and a matter of intimidation. And those are conditions that have been created. And so I think we need to have conversations about that. We have to have conversations about the conditions that make it necessary for people to have guns. I think, the conversation about Second Amendment rights and who has guns or not is also highly racialized because people are fine with white people having guns. It is seen as part of their American right. And then people want to get the guns out the hood because they don't think Black people are responsible enough to have guns, right? And so I think we need to be honest about how race plays into gun rights and why guns for some people are okay and guns for other people are not, which is the same as drugs. And so a lot of it is the same conversations, and understanding that guns may be more reasonable in certain drug markets than others, based on the conditions that drug trade is happening in. And we have to address the conditions that make that so. Neil, I know guns are
endless snaps to that. Endless snaps to that. I mean, in DC, literally the number one conversation of the mayor's office, our office, around public safety is gun violence, right? We're going to have 200 plus gun homicides in the city. Again, we're on pace for one of the worst years yet in 2020, and still, you know, we've expanded our restorative justice to gun cases, which I had a conference, which is what we call our intervention, with a young man who was arrested for gun possession, and we had a community-based cognitive behavioral therapist, me as the facilitator, and then a violence interrupter who was already a mentor to this young person in this conversation, a dialogue. And the groups for the young person are to talk about, first of all, what happened, why are you carrying this weapon, and what's the harm to the community, right? And to have that conversation, and what can you do going forward to make sure that to choose a different thing, because there are other people that you know in your life, people who you look up to, that don't need to use guns. And so that's sort of the setting, right? That's kind of how we proceed. And he said, well, you know, I guess when I'm 21, I can get my concealed carry, you know? And it was like, okay, you know, that's a good starting point, you know, but what are you going to do until then? And then the conversation became, you know, who trained you to use this weapon? Are you properly trained? Are you going to hurt yourself? So these aren't necessarily this isn't necessarily just a conversation, the actual conversation we had about, oh my God, you know, don't use this gun. And I could get in trouble for saying this, but it's what Kassandra said. You have to investigate the deeper things. What came out was that, of course, given who this young person needs to be in this extremely violent community, in order to mature, to come of age, to be independent, to move around in his community the way he needs to move around and feel safe, he felt that he needed to carry a gun. And let's start there with why is that versus just, you know, even though it's an epidemic, you know, you have to start broader. You have to make it safe to have that conversation. A lot of these young people, when we start having these conversations, they say they don't have friends, they have acquaintances. They can't trust anybody. Again, this culture of distrust. So, you know, and there's no supportive conversation like this even available. These poor young people are kind of, there's so many mixed messages and confusing messages. We need to make these young adults, young people particularly, feel, again, destigmatized first, feel supported in other ways first. Because the more stress, the more lack of resources, the more all these things mount up, of course, then the violence is exacerbated. So I couldn't agree more with what Kassandra was saying.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on here, but Kassandra, what you said about the drug prohibition policies and the conditions of crime that, I mean, you know, if you're in that business, if you're in that game, and unfortunately, a lot of people feel like they have to be in that game in order to make money to survive. We need money to survive. And that's a whole nother story as to how people get into that through our criminal justice system and get into that place. But the reason there are so many guns within our communities is because of drug prohibition laws. You know, the environment of that's created by drug prohibition is obviously, you have a business to protect, you have a piece of a territory or a piece of real estate to protect. And it's dog eat dog. You know, if you're not protecting your corner, I'm going to take it from you. If you're not protecting your supply, I'm going to take it from you. And, you know, that's the reason guns started to flow into our neighborhoods they have now. And now that guns are there, and Roman, to talk about what you were saying about the young man, in order for him to feel safe, he's got to have a gun. He's got to be strapped. because there are so many guns there, because of drug prohibition and people managing their supplies and businesses, that now when something kicks off, just a disagreement on something, when, now the thought process is, well, he's strapped, if I don't shoot first, or I'm going to need a gun to deal with this. We've also created conditions where folks don't know how to work out their differences. They don't have those skill sets or anyone positioned to guide them. That's why we need violence interrupters, as we were talking about earlier during this conversation, and creditable messengers and so on, to help our young people, deal with their differences among one another, whether it's in or outside of the drug trade. Now, when there's a disagreement, people are really quick to use the guns that they have. And again, for us to, and guns just don't go away. These gun buyback programs, let me tell you, those are jokes. Nobody's getting rid of their primary gun. People, understand something. I don't care how much money you're offering. If I got 3 guns, yeah, I'll give you 1. But let me tell you something. The guns that you're collecting are pieces of crap. The guns that you're paying $200 for are pieces of crap. If you want to get rid of the guns that are in your neighborhoods and in your communities, you got to get rid of the reasons for the guns being there. You just can't get rid of the guns. And guns, they're not like an orange or a piece of fruit that's going to rot over a period of time. You know what? Some of these guns are 50 years old, 60 years old, and they will still work. You got to get rid of the reasons for people using guns. And that's about the work that we've been talking about ever since the beginning of this conversation, about investing in our communities in these areas that we've been talking about, from mental health to you name it. So even if the guns are there, because again, they're just not going to disappear. Even if the guns are there, people are not going to use them. And that's the work that we need to do within our communities. And we need the resources to do it. And the resources are limited. So let's pull those resources from where they are, within corrections, within policing, do it the right way, through the right process, and then we'll get the results that we're all striving for, that we all want.
I just want to say one little thing. I know, Ife, you're trying to wrap it up, but oh man, I love doing panels with you. There's this, the other thing is like, it's not just like it's in addition to that, it's like people need to feel safe. People wouldn't use guns if they felt safe.
Right.
And it comes back to the need for people to feel safe. And, what's so interesting about gun violence is that it's drugs, but it's also about disrespect. Black people, we are so disrespected in so many ways, by so many entities, by each other, by other people, that just the mere notion of disrespect is enough to throw us off, right? And then we can retaliate in such a outscaled measure to even what the disrespect was. And people think that's because we're over exaggerating, but it's because it is disrespect on mountains of disrespect. If you're being disrespected every day, every time you wake up, when you walk in the elevator and the woman clutches her purse, or you walk in the store and they're following you, you walk into a store and the person tells you, well, that's not on sale, that's really expensive. You walk into the doctors and they tell you, do you really feel pain or are you looking for drugs? That that you are going in like even in the way that you use your hands. I'm literally on this webcast.
Don't forget the popo disrespecting you.
And the popo disrespecting you. I'm literally on this webcast with over 1,100 people, and I am an expressive person. And someone capped me in the chat to say, "Stop moving my hand." That's disrespect, right? And so, it's like everywhere. literally everywhere. So I think it's not only people feeling it's not only people feeling safe. It's not only people feeling their communities being invested in. It's also about how do we actually respect the dignity and affirm the
Right.
humanity of Black people.
And that's the key. When you have a lack of any reservoir for sourcing your own dignity. I had 2 violence interrupters on my porch yesterday, literally in the middle of our conversation. He had to go. One of them had to go because 2 of his mentees, or one of his mentees, got in a fight, and his lip was huge, and he was talking about getting a gun. I gotta get a gun. I gotta go after this dude. And he's saying, no, you don't have to that. So he's trying to provide him with the dignity and de-escalate that moment. Because when you have been stripped of your dignity for so long, and what you have in place is this toxic form of finding respect, power, and dignity, you will use it. And it's up to us, white people, Black people, privileged people, to do the difficult thing, which is hard, to say we have to stop. Even though there's a crisis and people are dying, just like with COVID, except this is much worse. It's been going on for much longer. To make a difference, we have to do something different. We have to do the political work to make it politically prioritized, to look at these deeper causes. Black people can't have nice things has been the unwritten, well, sometimes written, and mandate. If Black people can't have nice things, then they will be resorted to this sort of thing, and it's not their fault that they don't have nice things. Maybe that's too crass, but that is what it is.
Okay. I said I was going to try to wrap up like 15 minutes ago, but we got a really good question in the chat. And so I really want to ask it, and it might be a little spicy, but I think it's worth talking about. So this comes from Leah Friedman. Hey, Leah. I'm curious what the panelists think of Symposia's controversial piece that came out last week. This piece was written by David Nichols, criticizing maps for serving institutions, example, veterans police, that uphold white supremacy in order to get more approval for MDMA and psychedelics and bring them forth as legal medicine. MAPS said that part of their mission is to work together for collective liberation. How would you suggest they better embody that goal? And I promise it's the final question. Come on, who wants to take the first stab at it?
I think we're stumped.
What'd you say?
That's a good question, and I know for me, I'm stumped on that. So, Roman, Kassandra.
Yeah, I'll just say that for me personally, I think that, embodying that collective liberation, you have to be willing to understand that a lot of us, people like myself, have never felt safe around police and don't see them as, I guess, a part of our collective liberation. Since I was a kid, I always was taught that police aren't safe. They're not here to protect me. And so, you can't say that cops are, part of our collective liberation without recognizing that there's an entire history of harm and torture, like, embedded in this institution. So, I don't know, that's just me riffing.
So let me say this, and I don't know, chat will probably blow up right now after I say this, and explode. But there were, just like our soldiers in war, right? The Vietnam, the draft, there were a lot of good men and women who ended up fighting in these unjust wars that we've had around the globe. And psychologically, they're having a rough time with their experiences and post-traumatic stress. Same thing in policing. There are some people who got into the profession really thinking that it was something good to do. And they're screwed up now for a number of different reasons. Not saying that for everyone that put this uniform on and it's out there doing this work. Believe me, there are enough of those folks that never should have been allowed to don a uniform. But there are some people who got into the profession for the right reasons. They thought they were going to be really a part of something good. And now psychologically, they're not doing so good. And when some of those people continue to do the work, they hurt a lot of people. They themselves are hurting. They hurt other people. Their home lives are trashed. I mean, they're people just like anybody else. If psychedelics can help them, so be it. But again, in this, and again, I'm just a baby when it comes to psychedelics. I'm still learning a lot. I've learned a lot in this conversation here today. With a lot, when we're talking about psychedelics and the indigenous population and community, again, I think that I don't know how much conversation is occurring and work is occurring between our indigenous population in this country and what this question and surrounding this question and so on. But I don't know. I just know a lot of cops that are damaged goods from the work that they've been doing. And if they can be helped, I don't know, maybe this could help them.
Yeah, no, that's valid.
I think, sorry. So I will say, look, to me, this is a parallel conversation to abolition and what happens with when police kill people. Like, shouldn't they go to jail? I believe in abolition for everyone. I don't believe that there should be anyone that is caged. And so if what we're saying is that MDMA can help with trauma and people's healing, then I don't think that we should police who gets to get healed and who gets to have trauma. I do believe that people that are veterans and people that are police officers should have access to psychedelics in order to deal with the very real harms and trauma that they are experiencing in their lives. Another thing Deborah Peterson Small has taught me is that a lot of people that are in policing and also are in military are people from the working class and the working poor and have used those jobs as a way to get economic mobility, which goes back to slavery, where you get into a profession based on building wealth on the capture and subjugation of other people, right? And so it means that we have a carceral economy and that needs to be disrupted. It doesn't mean that the people that are partaking in this carceral economy should not be held accountable for the harm that they've done, but we need to contextualize why there's a carceral economy in the first place. Now, to the strategy of using police officers and veterans as a reason to push forward federal trials, that is a strategy that needs to be interrogated, because MAPS didn't choose to do trials with families dealing with gun violence in over-policed communities that are also dealing with complex grief and trauma. They chose police and veterans, not just because of their engagement with complex trauma, but also because they are pillars of the state. And so we are putting, like, we can help the state, right? And what are you helping the state to do? Are you fixing cops so that they don't have the trauma, so that they keep beating up Black people? Because if that's what you're doing, that's not collective liberation, right? Are you fixing cops and dealing with their trauma so that they might see the larger carceral economy and divest from it? That's different. But if you are doing this in order to keep people from seeing, to fix them, so that we could be like, look, they're in this job and now they're okay, and now they get to keep doing their job, then you are actually not in community and in collective liberation. And so I think we need to have a conversation as a movement about what is the role of policing, what is the role of picking that population in order to make the trials more amenable to the state. And if and that is a dedicated choice. And it would be different if MAPS was also working on policing issues, genuinely. But what it looks like is that we're working to fix the cogs in the carceral economy. And, that's a big deal for me to say, as, DPA works with MAPS and all these different things. And I'm the incoming executive director. But I'm a fucking Haitian person. And I'm clear about what the structures are. I'm clear about how it hurts our communities. And we just have to be like, you can't just use words. You can't just say collective
but come on,
liberation.
Kassandra. Come on now, Kassandra. Blacks are incapable of being affected by trauma.
You know what I'm saying? You can't just say that you're doing a thing. Like, are you fixing
well, and that's
them?
right. There's a
beating our ass? What are you fixing them for?
Right.
And I'm just reading the article and whatnot. There is a common theme, though, of we see perhaps, and I've worked with MAPS before, and I respect, there's a lot of perspectives here to be acknowledged and to have compassion for, but there's a common thread of, the people who are in power to move progress a lot of times are the same empowered, privileged actors, right? And they've set up these structures from a prior generation of what it meant to be progressive. And sometimes it was in these silos. Some of these efforts are 10, 20, 30 years in the making, where we were still, like you said, and I'm not an expert on drug policy, but in these silos of this is what it's going to take to make progress. And now it's like, oh, shoot, out of the bag, unless you realize that there is no what progress can we possibly make if we're not focusing on the destruction and dehumanization of people in our own society. It's becoming, thankfully, the veil is being lifted, that it's nonsensical to talk about any sort of justice unless this is a central pillar. And it rightfully makes us nervous when it is still, the organizations that are coming from a longer road of where these things weren't acknowledged and where this wasn't embodied in this way. So there's still more work to be done, and we have to continue to hold people accountable and have this safe space like here to tell it like it is. And then also, I do think respect. There's a whole conversation about canceling and it's different. I think it's helpful to hear different opinions and to be able to share different opinions and be able to change our minds about these things also as we figure this out.
Yes. So on that note, y'all, I have to wrap up. Thank you so much, Kassandra, Roman, Neil. Y'all were all really amazing. And I think that this was a very insightful conversation that we all learned something from. So thank you, guys. I will also say that Psychedelic Seminars will have a 4th installment in the Racial Justice series on August 8th with Sarah Reed and Ishmael Ali on the challenges and opportunities of psychedelic therapy within the system. So again, thank you guys so much. Thank you, audience, for your engagement. I appreciate you guys so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Saturday. Bye.
Thank you, Aoife, for being such a wonderful moderatress.
Great work. Great work.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Good seeing everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Kassandra. Appreciate
Bye.
you.
See you, Roman, Kassandra.
Bye-bye.